So we'll now move to the next presentation by Dr. Hunter, a Q study to determine attitude of women to their experience of urinary incontinence and use of absorbent pads.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's an honour to be here. This is my disclosure slide. Oh, sorry. Is that better? I apologise. So hello, my name's Amy Hunter and I'm from the University of Leeds. I'm going to talk to you about some of my PhD work today. So there's my disclosures. Okay. So the title of my thesis was looking at understanding the attitudes of women towards their experience of leakage and their use of absorbent products. And I did this as a mixed method study. So in the first stage, I worked with some women who became a reference group who have not sought treatment and who have not engaged with any healthcare for their leakage. And originally, I advertised for people who didn't have a diagnosis of urinary incontinence, and unsurprisingly, I got very little response. So the two women that came on board at that point said, if you want to talk to people that don't want to engage in healthcare, don't understand their incontinence as a health issue, you need to talk about leakage. So get rid of any terms to do with incontinence or anything that might be perceived as based in medicine. So that's what I did. I then conducted an interview study with 11 women, and the data from that informed a Q study. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So Q methodology is mostly used by psychologists, and it's a way of objectively measuring subjectivity. You can use a range of statements and ask people to rank those statements. So in this instance, I collected statements from the interview phase, and I refined those from hundreds into 43 statements, which covered a range of themes. For example, the environment around the women, using products, coping strategies, that kind of thing. And each of the statements is numbered and written onto a card. After women have sorted them, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment, rotated factor analysis is used in the first part of analysis. Because factor analysis uses numbers, obviously it's unable to interpret what those what the attitudes might be, and so secondary data is needed to help sort of flesh that out and provide a narrative. So I had secondary data in addition to the Q sorting process, which helped me analyse. So I'll just explain a little bit more about the data collection process. So I met with women face-to-face. It is a method that could be done online, but I felt that it was better to meet with people, because although it can be quite difficult to explain, actually, once women have seen it being demonstrated, they understood it. The other benefit of using this particular method was that I was able to gain a depth of information in a similar way to interviews, but actually women didn't have to tell me about their experience in a personal way. So if a statement said, leakage is very concerning, those women didn't have to give me examples of when that had been concerning for them. They were just able to rank that more highly and say that they agreed. So in the first sorting process, women were given a card, as you can see here, and asked to look at each statement and put them into one of three piles: either agree, disagree, or if they were unsure, neutral, or felt differently, they put them into a middle pile. They were then asked to refine those piles, and eventually, sometimes after a little bit of discussion, sometimes they were able to do this without facilitation at all. I asked them to put the statement cards onto a quasi-normal distribution curve. So statements that they strongly agreed with went into the column, the +4 column, whereas statements that they strongly disagreed with went into the -4 column. And so it was forced choice at that point. So they'd had free choice when they were just doing the 3 piles, and then it became forced choice. And for those women who were interested in talking about their experience, this process gave them opportunity to talk. They were able to write things down. I gave them a little booklet if they wanted to make notes. Okay, so after analysis, I had 5 attitude types. These are known as factors in Q methodology. And I'm going to just quickly, briefly tell you a little bit about the narrative of each of one of those. So the first factors were both highly significant. And this first factor, I'm sure you will recognise women that you've worked with who have felt similarly. So this accounted for about 11% of the variance, and 4 women fitted almost perfectly into this attitude type. They perceived that their symptoms were occurring often and had started fairly recently. But other than that, these women didn't seem to have an awful lot in common. So these women were uncertain about their experience, what was happening to them. They wanted information and said that they would have welcomed information before symptoms had occurred. They were very aware of what others might think of them. They didn't want to be stereotyped, and they felt that there were negative attitudes surrounding leakage. They wanted to keep it secret, and if a GP, a general practitioner, were to ask them about it, they would disclose, but otherwise were unlikely to tell a health professional. Some of these women had tried to access help. When I asked them about help seeking, they said that they had spoken to somebody, but actually it wouldn't be in the way that we would understand help seeking. It was much more tentative than that, so they may have mentioned in an appointment for something else, perhaps, that they'd experienced this, and it hadn't necessarily been understood or never understood as a cry for help, basically. Okay, factor 2, carry on regardless, accounted for 8%, and these women had regular symptoms, but they felt more in control of those symptoms. They carried on in spite of the leakage they experienced, and even when they were unable to plan for leakage, they still felt that they were in control. They loved being able to use absorbent products and had absolutely no issue with their use. They were able to talk openly with people, but they wouldn't, shout it to the world. They wanted to just speak to people that they thought would be most understanding. And they were quite happy with their situation as it was, no interest in changing it. These 2 factors I wanted to present to you very briefly, but these were the least statistically significant. However, because it was a small study, I think it's worth having the conversation about these, that actually there's work here that could be built on in future. So they still accounted for a decent amount of variance, but their eigenvalues were below 1. So factor 3, these ladies were all working, they were busy, and they didn't prioritise their leakage experience. There were things that were more important. However, they felt confident to manage leakage alone and didn't see it as a health problem. And if they were going to seek help, it wouldn't necessarily be through healthcare. They would perhaps start Pilates, for example, or go to a pharmacist as a first port of call. Factor 4, first-line defence. These women, they felt guilty they felt that it was their fault that they experienced leakage. There was perhaps something that they could have done years gone by that could have stopped this. And so they wanted to manage it in secret. They might have a significant other that they told about this experience, but the guilt and the shame for these women was overwhelming. And finally, limited byproducts. These women, again, were happy with their experience and valued products. They were prepared to pay for better products, and they didn't want intervention. They just wanted something that they could buy off the shelves that would meet more of their needs. So, I won't speak to you about that, but that's a table that I designed because the reference group felt that it was easier for women to understand. So in summary, basically there are a range of attitudes, and these could help us in future designing interventions and products. So thank you. And I'm sorry.
The floor is now open for question. I would like to ask a question. I'm not familiar with the Q methodology. I thought it was very interesting. I'm just wondering, what now? What would be your next step after this, and how would you implement it?
I think the next step really is to build on this. So this was very small, and actually working with people without a diagnosis, getting into the community, I think was really useful. And so what I would like to do is sort of take this perhaps to patient groups, see if we've got similar attitudes, because if we have, then we can learn much more about those women that aren't seeking help, that are difficult to engage with. So there's conversations that are happening locally now within a couple of trusts that hopefully once this work's finished, we might be able to use what we've learned here and then do some work with their patient groups.
Okay. Any question for the floor? No? So I think, thank you.
So we have now the last presentation, effect of physical activity measured by the International Physical Activity Questionnaire on the prevalence of stress urinary incontinence in young women, from Magdalena Agowska, a physiotherapist from Slovak Republic.
Thank you for the opportunity to present our research, effect of physical activity measured by the International Physical Activity Questionnaire, IPEQ, on the prevalence of stress urinary incontinence in young women. Our research was not funded by any institution and sponsor. The aims of our study. The first objective was to compare the intensity of physical activity in sport women and non-sport women. The second objective was to determine the prevalence of symptoms of stress urinary incontinence. The third objective was to investigate the impact of urinary incontinence on quality of life. We used the International Physical Activity Questionnaire, which measured in metabolic equivalent minutes per week. Study design. The research population comprised a sample of sportswomen and non-sportswomen. The sportswomen were randomly selected from National Register of Sport Clubs. The non-sportswomen were randomly selected from 3 universities. The inclusion criteria. Nulliparous women aged from 18 to 35 years. In sport women, high-intensity physical activity confirmed by IPEQ questionnaire with cumulative metabolic equivalent over 3,000 minutes per week. Performing sport in the last 3 months, at least 3 days a week, for more than 2 years. in non-sport women, low-intensity physical activity confirmed by IPEQ questionnaire with cumulative metabolic equivalent under 600 minutes per week in last 3 months. The exclusion criteria: sport women with handicaps, combination of multiple sports, surgical treatment of gynecological and urological illnesses, infection of urinary tract, respiratory disease, incomplete questionnaires, refusal to participate, body mass index above 30, and urgency urinary incontinence according to overactive bladder questionnaire. Methods: International Consultation on Incontinence Questionnaire, short form, the Overactive Bladder Questionnaire, the Incontinence Quality of Life Scale, the International Physical Activity Questionnaire. Formula for cumulative metabolic equivalent was value of metabolic equivalent times minutes of sport activities during the day times days per week. At this slide you can see information about IPEQ questionnaire. The value of metabolic equivalent for low intensity of physical activity according to IPEQ questionnaire was 3.3. Example, slow walking. The value for metabolic equivalent according IPEQ questionnaire for high intensity of physical activity was 8. Example, running, heavy weightlifting. Enrollment flow diagram. Non-sport women were randomly selected from 3 universities, number 2016. Sport women were randomly selected from National Register of Sport Clubs, number 2004. From the time period from March to November 2016, every 4 women were randomly selected by an independent person. 105 women were included by a member of research team who did not take part in the next study. Excluded sport women and non-sport women as illustrated in the graph. Included non-sport women, 287. Included sport women, 270. The first results. Demographic data are summarized in Table 1. Prevalence of stress urinary incontinence. A slight urinary leakage was reported during physical activity and confirmed by total ICEQ score in 33 6.14 sports women and 11 2.4 non-sports women. The second results. IPEQ questionnaire confirmed high intensity of physical activity in sport women and a low intensity of physical activity in controls non-sport women. ICEQ result confirmed mild difficulties with urinary leakage and significant differences between sport women and controls. The third results, quality of life scale, recorded significantly worse parameters in sport women in total score, avoidance and limiting behavior score, psychosocial impact score, and social embarrassment score. The 4 results. Chance of developing stress urinary incontinence was with odds ratio 3.49. Concluding message. The IPEQ result confirmed the high intensity of physical activity in sport women with cumulative metabolic equivalent over 3,000 minutes per week, the low intensity in non-sport women with cumulative metabolic equivalent up to 6 minutes per week. Sport women have 2.49 times higher chance of developing stress urinary incontinence compared to non-sport women. Mild difficulties with stress urinary incontinence has a negative impact on quality of life. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.